All life rests on appearance, art, illusion, optics, the need for perspective and for error. Friedrich Nietzsche is many things: an existentialist philosopher, an arch critic of religion, and a mad genius. But he was also a master at something most people could only dream of: turning suffering into something beautiful, and making pain its own form of pleasure. And nowhere is this more evident than in his very first book, The Birth of Tragedy. This is among Nietzsche's most controversial works, and he himself came to despise many aspects of it. But today, we will explore it, place it in the context of Nietzsche's wider thoughts, and find out that it still has much to teach us about coping with the nastier sides of life. Get ready to learn the limits of logic, how some truths are too painful to examine head-on, and what music has to do with existential enlightenment. Since I want to contextualize The Birth of Tragedy within Nietzsche's wider corpus, I will inevitably skim over some of the details he will later disavow and instead hone in on what is consistent with his later thought. While The Birth of Tragedy itself focuses mainly on art, for Nietzsche, the life of art and the art of life are not so different. And mankind has the greatest gift and the greatest curse of all. We are both our own artists and the canvas on which we paint. But first, let's dive into the two forces that dominate The Birth of Tragedy, and how they are embodied by two famous Greek deities. 1. Apollo, Dionysus, and unbearable truths. According to legend, there once stood a veiled statue of the goddess Isis in the Egyptian city of Sais. At the base of her statue, there was a message, which read, "I am all that has been and is and shall be, and no mortal has ever lifted my mantle." All in the city warned against lifting the goddess's holy veil, lest they gaze upon her unadorned face and suffer the terrible consequences. But one day, a bold adventurer ignored all of these warnings and pierced the shroud, gazing upon the statue in its full glory. At that very moment, he went mad, and he spent the rest of his days in a state of unbearable sorrow, warning others not to make the same mistake he did, and to afford the goddess the proper respect of her protective garment. Underlying this myth is a theme that echoes through 19th century philosophy, and which Nietzsche will inherit from Schopenhauer. There are some truths about life that are so unbearable that if most people were to look upon them unprepared, they would either go insane or fall into permanent disenchantment. This idea loomed especially large in early Nietzsche, since he was still of the opinion that this world was irredeemably infused with suffering. And in The Birth of Tragedy, he says one of the primary ways that we humans deal with the pains of life is through art. Specifically, he outlines two approaches, one based on the god Apollo and the other on the god Dionysus. In the sphere of the Apollonian, we find many of the things we now associate with classical beauty. There is form, reason, logic, pleasure to the eyes, and much, much more. In the Apollonian approach, the world is carved up and we try to make sense of it. For instance, let's look at the metaphor of a sculptor. When Michelangelo was carving his statue of David, he reportedly said that he merely cut away all of the pieces that were not David. This is emblematic of Apollonian art. Michelangelo was using reason and discernment to separate the form of David from the unhewn hunk of marble he was presented with. This general approach to life and aesthetics is logical, analytic, and requires careful distinctions between objects. It prioritizes separation and conceptual neatness over unity. And according to Nietzsche, it also promulgates an illusion. At the time of writing The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche was still an ardent follower of Schopenhauer's philosophy, which held that the distinctions between objects were just deceptive appearances, and that the world as it truly existed was just a chaotic and irrational bundle of will. Nietzsche will later come to reject this idea, but that does not mean that he lets go of the notion of unbearable truths entirely. In his later works, he says the realization that there are no values out in the world and that we must craft them for ourselves via our wills crush a huge number of people, specifically those that do not have the strength or vitality to cope with it. Likewise, the Apollonian approach to life is in conflict with Nietzsche's idea that we are fundamentally instinctual and power-driven creatures. And if most people realize this aspect of being human, it would completely destroy their self-conception. So while the Apollonian is originally conceived of as illusory because of its emphasis on separateness and distinction, it would ultimately remain illusory in Nietzsche's later philosophy because of its rosy view of the world as rationally dictated, orderly, and given sensible form and value. In total contrast to this approach is the Dionysian. This is the equivalent of lifting the veil from the goddess recklessly and hastily. Nietzsche associates the experience of the Dionysian with things like drug-fueled orgiastic ecstasies, as well as the heights of musical rapture. It is a state defined by intoxication, of giving into our instincts, and a kind of ego death. This makes it a terrifying yet beautiful state to be in, and for Nietzsche it displays the dark side of life in its full, unholy glory. It reveals the arbitrariness of social and moral boundaries, and even of the boundaries between the self and the other. For Nietzsche, it is when we are in contact with the Dionysian that we experience the true, unfettered chaos and irrationality of the world. For early Nietzsche, this would be Schopenhauer's will-based metaphysics. But for later Nietzsche, it could easily be the complete valuelessness of external reality, where there is no moral distinction between objects. While the nature of the uncomfortable truth changes, the existence of it remains throughout Nietzsche's work. And the Dionysian remains an important concept for Nietzsche, to the extent that he began signing off letters with the name Dionysus later in life, though he's then using the term in a slightly different way. For Nietzsche, the predominant method of dealing with the sufferings of life in the modern day was Apollonian. This is partly how he saw Christianity, as an illusion that brought comfort through its teachings. But he saw the philosophies of Kant and Hegel in the same way. This is part of the reason he begins to abhor system builders in his later works. He thought that grand philosophical systems were a kind of illusory dogma, something that lets you run away from life rather than embrace it. And this whole approach is run through with Apollo. At the same time, he recognized that the pure Dionysian was far too much for almost anyone. Much like the man who went mad after looking beneath the goddess's veil, an unfettered Dionysian outlook would drive most people to despair. Even in ancient Greece, a culture Nietzsche thought was composed of very strong people, the Dionysian experience of ecstatic intoxication was performed in short, controlled, ritualistic settings. This could be seen as a form of dose moderation. If someone only occasionally encounters the pure Dionysiac, then that allows them to manage their exposure. There is some conflict in the academic literature over whether, in Nietzsche's later writings, he thinks that the strongest people could face the Dionysian head-on with no moderating force. But, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche says the best of both worlds can be achieved, and we can use the Apollonian to grant pleasure and form to the Dionysian. That is, we can glimpse the terrors of life through the prism of beauty. And that is where he introduces his notion of a tragedy. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing to my channel or my Patreon. The links are in the description. 2. Beware Greeks bearing scripts. In the book of Job, lust is described as something that will burn all the way to hell, while elsewhere in the Bible, desire within the context of marriage is viewed as a beautiful thing. Aristotle used to say that righteous anger could be fantastic if used in defense of honor or virtue, but that the vice of wrath is a horribly destructive force. Dostoevsky praised self-sacrifice in many of his novels, but at the same time portrayed people throwing their lives away over unjustifiable self-hatred. Time and time again, philosophers have described our passionate and powerful forces as almost intimidating in their vitality, and often the solution is found in some form of constraint. The power is indulged and sometimes even strengthened, but only in its proper place. In some ways, Nietzsche's description of what constitutes a tragedy is well within this tradition. He says that a true tragedy melds the Dionysian and Apollonian together in a way that allows us to feel and realize some of the deeper truths of intoxication, without totally losing ourselves in them. And for Nietzsche, the Greek tragedy does this perfectly. In a traditional Greek tragedy, some pretty dire themes are tackled. To take just one example, in Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, we follow the king of Thebes, as he investigates a curse that has been laid upon his city due to some great crime against nature. Wondering who could have done this, Oedipus searches high and low until eventually he comes to an awful discovery. He is the man committing this grave injustice. Due to him being adopted and not knowing his biological parentage, he had accidentally killed his own natural father and married his biological mother. It is this offense that the gods have seen fit to punish. In an act of self-abasement and penance, Oedipus gouges out his own eyes and flees into exile. Talk about lending aesthetic beauty to the sufferings of the world. Additionally, an essential component of Greek tragedy is the use of musical chorus, and this is also where its Dionysian aspect comes into play. Nietzsche thinks music is a more Dionysian art form than any spoken word or sculpture could be, because it is not attempting to represent anything else, it It speaks simply to the instincts and the emotions. This is another view that he inherited from Schopenhauer, but also did end up maintaining in his later writings, reaffirming his position that, without music, life would be a mistake. We can also see the Dionysian in the primal elements of this tragic story. Oedipus is not in a predicament he can make sense of, and the audience cannot quite understand it either. It bypasses our purely rational faculties and touches us, somewhere that is certainly psychologically impactful, but that we cannot quite put into words. Nonetheless, for Nietzsche, a tragedy can only be a tragedy with the heavy involvement of music, which is one of the reasons he thought the Gesamtkunstwerk of Richard Wagner would bring about a rebirth of tragedy, though he later disavowed that view as well. At the same time, there are elements of Apollo here as well. Oedipus Rex has structure. It is a script performed by actors who are distinct characters. And while the themes of the story speak directly to our sense of fear, disgust, anger, and more, its plot is very simple to follow. Much like containing the destructive force of a fire within a fireplace and then using it to heat our house, Sophocles has kept the raging whirlwind of Dionysus safely ensconced within the boundaries of a sensible play. Thus, we get to glimpse at terrible truths without being overwhelmed by orgiastic Dionysianism. For Nietzsche, this is partly what gave tragedy its existential and philosophical power. It elevates the struggles and sufferings of life and the unbearable truths of the world into an art form. Through its themes and its music, it communicates the unpredictable chaos and arbitrariness of life, but it does so at a distance. It reminds me a bit of the moment in the Divine Comedy where Dante gazes upon God, but only reflected in the eyes of Beatrice. For Nietzsche, tragedy gives us a reflection of something potentially very overwhelming, but given just enough structure and comprehensibility that it does us good rather than ill, provided that we are strong enough to withstand even this. To return to the metaphor of the veiled goddess, tragedy would be like giving her a translucent covering. People could gaze upon her, but only through a mediating material. For Nietzsche, the blurry covering is the Apollonian, and lying beneath is the chaotic Dionysian. It is something of a matter of interpretation whether Nietzsche still sees Apollo as illusory in the context of tragedy or not. From one perspective, we could say that the Apollonian is still lying to us. It's obscuring the unbearable truth that lies beneath. But from another perspective, it is enhancing it by making it understandable not just at an instinctual level, but at a cognitive one as well. We have to wear sunglasses during an eclipse, but not to mar the experience of gazing upon it, but rather to stop the shards of sunlight from robbing us of our vision entirely. For Nietzsche, tragedy is the harmony of the Apollonian and the Dionysian approaches to life, and in some ways it is greater than the sum of its parts. However, he also thinks that we have slowly lost touch with the Dionysian. Today we praise logic, reason, and order, but we have lost our respect for chaos, instinct, and all that is messy and emotional about being human. And for Nietzsche, this is an enormous shame. For him, to lose touch with the Dionysian is to degrade and weaken some of our most powerful drives. It's as if, in our haste to avoid being lustful or wrathful or proud, we instead have become completely jellified and passive. Put a pin in this, as we're going to come back to it later. In some of his later works, Nietzsche lays the blame for this at the feet of St. Paul and early Christianity. But in The Birth of Tragedy, he identifies an earlier culprit, and that is Socrates himself. According to Nietzsche, Socrates and his disciples went beyond simply venerating the Apollonian logical and separatist approach to life, and they began to overshoot, condemning and punishing any flecks of Dionysus that they could find. This had the effect of slowly putting us out of touch with our more primal and animal side, which for him is the side that could embrace suffering. And of course, Nietzsche wants to remedy this, which is just our next point. 3. Humanity as art and artist. Perhaps one of the underrated aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy is that despite its occasional scattered and self-contradictory nature, it has a consistent aim and theme behind much of it. How do we cope with the sufferings of life without denying or running from them, making them meaningful rather than crushing? Or, to put it another way, how do we learn to love life in its entirety, rather than simply looking forward to the pleasant bits and hating the unpleasant bits? The importance of this is very clear in the framing of The Birth of Tragedy, where art is presented as a way of lending dignity to the sufferings of the world. But now, I want to draw attention to how Nietzsche characterizes the project of being a human in a very similar way. Because, strange as it may seem, Nietzsche thinks part of learning to embrace life is turning yourself into a work of art, where you are both the composer and the symphony. I recently came across a fantastic article by David Crane exploring this very idea. He draws a comparison between Nietzsche's analysis of art in The Birth of Tragedy and what he says in The Gay Science about giving oneself style. I'm going to put my own flair on Crane's interpretation here, but I will largely be drawing from his work. Essentially, just as Nietzsche sees art as containing opposing elements, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and that in the highest forms of art these two forces are balanced and reconciled, he thinks that our own wills consist of the same sorts of conflicting drives and desires. In itself, this is a fairly straightforward idea. At any one moment, I may want to scratch my head, begin writing a book, apply for PhDs, script a video, make some toast, and scroll mindlessly on Facebook. But if I allow each of these desires to have equal weight, then I will never get anything done. My will would become fragmented, or to use Nietzsche's terminology, disorganized. This is one way in which Nietzsche thinks we can become philosophically sick, and so lose touch with our love of life. Now, there are various ways to respond to this. One is to weaken some aspect of our wills. So I might start to suppress some part of my desires or instincts in order to give primacy to other ones. This is what Nietzsche thinks civilization does for the most part. It tells us to clamp down on some aspects of ourselves to maintain good order in the state. But for Nietzsche, this is not the ideal solution because we are not living up to our potential. Our wills are becoming more unified in a sense, sure, but they are also becoming weaker. On the other hand, if we learn to make these drives work in harmony, then we end up in an analogous situation to the Greek tragedy. Just like in Oedipus Rex, the script, chorus, music, and actors come together in order to communicate one whole dramatic message. Our instinct, reason, and much more are unified into a single will, and rather than any aspect of that will being weakened, it is morphed into something greater than the sum of its parts. And for Nietzsche, just like in a Greek tragedy, this unification can help make suffering itself more bearable. In the action of unifying and organizing our wills, Nietzsche thinks we will simultaneously be affirming every aspect of ourselves. We will be embracing our drives while at the same time giving them structure. This aspect of self-affirmation is very closely related to Nietzsche's idea of amor fati, the unconditional embrace of whatever happens to us in life. While we are crafting our characters and organizing our wills, we will simultaneously be cultivating an attitude to life which imbues our sufferings with the same sort of honor as we viewed the pains of Oedipus. Just as we look at him gouging out his eyes and are both horrified yet also appreciate its role in the drama, Nietzsche wants us to suffer, but at the same time to find that suffering meaningful, and as a result to rejoice in it. This is reflected in the way he describes both the Übermensch in Thus Spake Zarathustra and the free spirits in some of his other works. In both cases, he characterizes them as not just tolerating suffering, but taking a strange joy in it. They have made their lives works of art, and in doing so have transformed every misfortune into part of the dance. For Nietzsche, this is part of what allows them to embrace life wholeheartedly, and he says this can only be done from a position of deep strength. We also see this interplay of opposing forces in his motif of going down in order to ascend. Just like how in a tragedy there is beauty made through the sufferings of the characters, Nietzsche paints human development as a mixture of ascension, but also descension. And he says it is only through taking life seriously, by which he means not denying any of its unpleasant or painful aspects, that we can emerge on the other side with a comedic and joyful attitude. That is, Nietzsche thinks that true joy without self-deception lies on the other side of a lot of suffering and the embrace of our instincts. It is only by strengthening our wills and learning to give them form and organization that we can look at the hardships of life in the face and still say yes to it. We must find unity in our own Apollonian and Dionysian sides. For Nietzsche, loving life is not a trite expression meant to comfort us in hard times, but lies at the end of a marathon of philosophical development, where we go through each of the trials and tribulations of existence, lending them meaning and significance, so that eventually we can look upon our own sufferings as if they were of a character in our favorite play. Potent and agonizing, to be sure, but at the same time, deeply purposeful. To paraphrase Nietzsche, our lives are existentially elevated by treating them as an aesthetic phenomenon. We are the art and the artist, and it is only through both creation and being created that he thinks our own tragedies can be sanctified, and we can learn to bear the slings and arrows of whatever life throws at us. This is also evidenced by how closely Nietzsche associates power, joy, and creativity. There is a lot going on there, and we have brushed over a lot of detail, but the key thing to take away is this. For Nietzsche, our lives are very similar to works of art, and viewing them through this lens is what can help us make sense of the worst parts of them. It helps us take a step back and see the significance of all of our pain. But finally, I want to focus on what Nietzsche thinks has killed tragedy and what we have lost in the process. Because along with the death of tragedy, Nietzsche thinks a good portion of human potential has perished. 4. An excess of Apollo. The idea of reason as a universal good is pretty well embedded into our social consciousness. While I was at university, I primarily studied logic, and it really can be enchanting with its beauty. The precision, the structure, the fact that you can sort something out with a fellow logician by using inference rules and some agreed upon definitions. It is all so brilliant that it can make you forget that the rest of the world exists. And part of Nietzsche's philosophy, both in The Birth of Tragedy and in his later writings, is that we have gone too far down the Apollonian reason-based way of doing things, and could stand to let some Dionysus back into both our art and our lives. As I said earlier in the video, Nietzsche identifies Socrates as the killer of tragedy. And this is only the first of a series of barrages he will throw at the old philosopher throughout his works. For instance, in one of his later books, Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche criticizes Socrates for being part of the cultural mesh that weakened our instinctive wills. He said that Socrates prized reason so much that he effectively reasoned his way out of loving life. Here he is referencing Plato's Phaedo, where Socrates describes how a philosopher does not hold on to life too strongly and instead defers to logic, which tells him of a blissful world to come and that the city-state has the right to take one's life from them. This is why Socrates will not run from the judgment of Athens, who have unjustly condemned him to death. Instead, his reason tells him to stay and accept the penalty, overriding his baser instincts to live at almost any cost. This all strikes Nietzsche as completely absurd. For him, what Socrates is doing is denying his valuable instincts and ultimately denying life in the process. If we can reason out that our lives are basically worthless and that death would be an acceptable scenario, then Nietzsche thinks that all that tells us is that we have become sick through our worship of logic. If we are going to love our lives and affirm them, then we will need our deepest illogical drives. After all, these have the power to scream in the face of an impossible situation that we still want to live and that life is still valuable, whereas pure reason might tell us to give up the ghost. At least, that is Nietzsche's view. And I find this approach fascinating, partly because it's really quite unintuitive. Many of us are so used to deferring to reason as the ultimate judge of everything in our lives. And this has a rich tradition which stretches at least as far back as ancient Greece. Even Aristotle, with his broadly naturalistic approach to mankind, said that living in accordance with reason was what was best for us. But Nietzsche's philosophy uses very different standards. It will judge everything, including reason or morality, based on whether this will hinder or help our ability to love life unconditionally. This is because he is very skeptical of the old Greek idea that reason, virtue, and happiness all come together. And upon reflection, he may have a point. The idea that reason is the way to achieve joy does rest on this underlying principle that we are primarily rational creatures and that we are ordered towards rational ends. But Nietzsche throws this idea into question, and he is not alone. All through the 19th and 20th centuries, people were exploring the limits of rationality for living a full life. Is it possible that sometimes reason could be existentially destructive, and it is actually the irrational that we need to embrace in order to have amor fati? For instance, Kierkegaard held that a leap of faith into unconditional commitment to either an idea or a set of ideas was the only way to unlock some of the greatest aspects of life. And he also said that this was, to a certain extent, irrational. Nietzsche's recommendation of amor fati is explicitly irrational. It relies on affirming whatever happens to us, however unpleasant it is. And not because this will pay off in the future, but instead because we insist that these experiences are valuable in and of themselves. Schopenhauer placed a high premium on the illusions that help us make sense of life without having to look its insufferability directly in the eye. Going into the 20th century, as French existentialism developed, there was a real question of how we can view our lives as subjectively meaningful, and what role reason played in this. In modern philosophy, the idea of what constitutes rationality itself is sort of an open question with various different definitions and approaches. And it is a non-trivial issue to discover which areas of life rationality is best placed to solve, and when we should be drawing on more Dionysian means. Much of Nietzsche's work can be viewed as a reaction to our over-reliance on the Apollonian. His glorification of our instincts, exploration of our deeper irrational wills, and his critique of Socratic dialect can all be seen as a corrective mechanism. Ultimately, he does not want to give in to pure instinct either. He sees this as bestial. He wants us to construct the human soul very much like a Greek tragedy, with justice given to both our rational and instinctive parts, and our entire will harmonized with itself in an act of self-overcoming. He wants the sufferings and joys of our lives to work in tandem, and for us to be redeemed by this shared participation in the great work that is our existence. For Nietzsche, so in art as in life. And the themes of his existential philosophy are found in this early work on aesthetics. Since antiquity, philosophers have praised and prized beauty, but Nietzsche is one of the only thinkers to take this to the extreme, to view human life itself as if it is a great work of art, using this framing to embrace not just its inherently pleasurable moments, but also its most tragic. And this idea is certainly worth some reflection, whether we wholeheartedly agree with it or reject it outright. Is there such a thing as being too reasonable? And could we all stand to have a little bit more Dionysus in our lives? But if you want to explore some of these complex Nietzschean ideas in greater detail, then check out my full Nietzsche playlist here. And stick around for more on thinking to improve your life.